to another question, which is, does that female baboon know anything about what that other female baboon knows about their shared social world? And that was something that I think we all assume, first of all. I mean, your laptop computer has agency, and it gets angry at you sometimes, and you get angry at it, and so on. And we easily make these attributions of that kind of awareness to not only other people, but to our dogs, our cats, and of course to chimpanzees and baboons and so on. But that's not necessarily a safe assumption, and there's been some really important work and a lot of progress made recently addressing the question of what do they know about the minds of others. And just as a bit of empirical evidence, and maybe people can pick up on this, I think one very important empirical finding in recent work on great apes was Danny Povinelli's presentation of negative evidence for the ability of chimpanzees to attribute mental states to others. That is, we assume they know what others want, what others feel, what others know or don't know. And he did quite a long series of experiments expecting to find justification for that assumption, and he concluded at the end that no, it's not justified. They don't seem to have these abilities. And the particular importance of that was he inspired a lot of other people to try to show that he was wrong. And that led to some really good experimental work that is difficult to translate into observational study in the wild, but it's a challenge for the future to figure out how we're going to do that. But now we would say that, well, yes, in fact, chimpanzees do have some abilities. We don't yet know how extensive they are, but it is pretty clear that they can know something about what's going on in the minds of other chimpanzees.
Joan, you're shaking your head on that?
I agree. I think that one of the really remarkable things over the last couple decades is that mainly what we do when we watch animals is we can record what they do. And everyone I know who spent a lot of time out in the field or watching animals someplace, you have this running dialogue in your head, where you have this little conversation with them, So, how are you feeling? What are you doing? Why did you do that? And so we have these methods now that we can get at what they're thinking and how they're feeling. So we can get inside the animals in a really systematic way. I mean, we don't have to just, well, I wouldn't like that. We don't have to consult our intuition. We can actually say, what are you thinking now? And that is just unbelievable that we can do this with animals.
So you're not fearful that we're anthropomorphizing them too much? Yeah.
Well, I think we're letting them tell us. And we have these methods to extract, to translate what they're saying. So I think it's meant that we don't have to rely on our anthropomorphic intuitions. We can actually ask them the question in quite rigorous but quite sensitive ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a bit about something was brought up a little bit, but wasn't talked a lot about today that I found when I first heard about this 20 years ago, is that the bonobos. Talked a lot about chimps. We haven't talked a lot about bonobos, except to see that little branch on the tree up there. How are they different? Bonobos different than chimpanzees and gorillas. And when I first saw this, I'll just share something with you. I was at a meeting of journalists, and a scientist, I don't remember, I guess it was over 20 years, about 20 years ago, a researcher brought in a film of bonobos in the wild doing things totally different than chimpanzees were doing. And someone asked him, can you give me the definition in a layperson's definition, if I'm going on the evening news tonight and I want to describe bonobo behavior different than a chimpanzee, can you come up with something I could use? And he said, very simple. He said, if we get a big refrigerator box, a packing crate, and we give the packing crate to bonobos and we give the packing crate to chimpanzees, there'll be two great differences in behavior. The chimpanzees will fight over who owns the box, and the bonobos will go in and have sex inside the box. And now, is that any clear for you? Any clearer? Enough to make that's really said at all. How different? Anybody want to talk about bonobos and how different they are? Go ahead, Diane.
One of the big differences, well, I don't know if many of you saw the films on Thursday night that were shown, where Furuichi described, based on their long-term work at Wamba, some of the basic differences between bonobos and chimpanzees. And one of the fundamental things is that in chimpanzees, males are dominant to females. So even in the case of one site where there's only one male or a very limited number of males and many more females, chimpanzee males are dominant and often aggressive in their behavior towards females. And in bonobo society, who are equally closely related to humans, you have females that are, but we can discuss whether they're dominant to males or not, but males are certainly not dominant to females. And even males achieve power based on the support of their mothers and female allies. So that's one really fundamental. But I think most anybody who watched them would also be very struck with the differences in how they deal with their neighboring communities or with stress. And the box metaphor that you used works perfectly, because we saw from Richard Rangan's talk this morning about essentially warfare of chimpanzees with different communities, and males being highly aggressive and targeting aggression towards and killing males in other communities. And with bonobos, you can have very calm interactions between individuals in different communities, as we saw in the film on Thursday. And even females will mate with males from the other communities under the eyes of the males of that community. So there are some very, very fundamental differences between bonobo and chimpanzee socially. And the problem is we hear about chimpanzees so much more.
Yes, that was my point. Yeah.
Because they have been studied for so much longer, and because political problems have made bonobos very difficult to study in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
David?
Yeah, we know a lot more about chimpanzees, not nearly as much as we would like to know. But it's partly because there have been more chimpanzee study sites, more long-term projects, and also because the research started sooner. And I find it interesting that we've gone from essentially knowing nothing about bonobos to knowing a bit and thinking there's that much difference between bonobos and chimpanzees, to now knowing a bit more about both variation among different populations and perhaps subspecies of chimpanzees, and more about bonobos. And the differences have gone, in my mind, more like that. There apparently are some real differences, and some of them probably have ecological bases, and those might have led to differences in selective pressures that have led to real differences in temperament and psychology that have a genetic basis between bonobos and chimpanzees. But the public perception, you don't hear as much about bonobos, but what you do hear has not caught up with this trajectory of, and I think it's still up here somewhere. So for example, we do know from reports from the wild that relationships between neighboring communities of bonobos are rather antagonistic. And the public perception is they get along fine all of the time. They don't have any problems with the neighbors. What I've read in the literature from my colleagues is that that's not really accurate, but they so far seem to be quite different from chimpanzees in that respect, and no one has seen them do the kind of boundary patrolling and coalitionary aggression directed at outsiders that can lead to fatal attacks that Richard Wrangham was talking about this morning. And Richard himself has written, I think, quite convincingly about some ecological differences between chimpanzees and bonobos that may ultimately be behind that. It's the imbalance of power that chimpanzees can achieve is simply not possible for bonobos. But that also, it's not that bonobos would do it if they got the chance. They just